Okay, this is the first video recording for chapter 1. Let's get into the materials. I wanted to open up this chapter actually with a case of a mass murderer, actually an old case that's not well known in the United States. It is an American case. But I wanted to lay that out at first to just get us introduced to this idea of a mass murderer compared to a serial killer. So let's jump into it, and then we'll follow up with the analysis afterwards. So this man's name, this mass killer's name, was Andrew Kehoe. He was born in 1872 in rural Michigan. He came from a large family, 12 siblings, not that uncommon back in the 1800s. His mother died when he was 5. He was raised by a stepmother. He fought with her and resented her not being his real biological mother. When he was 14, his stepmom's dress caught fire. Of course, back then in the late 1800s, that they still made use of open fires to cook, and that it was not that uncommon for a woman's dress to catch on fire as she worked around the fire. So he threw water on her, but there was burning oil involved, and that just spread the fire. It didn't help, it made things worse. And so she burned to death, and she burned to death right in front of him. So that clearly was a traumatic experience. But he was able to grow up and to successfully attend college. He studied electrical engineering in college, which again, for that long ago, was pretty exceptional. Showed real ability, that he was able to attend college and study in a challenging major, not a really common thing that people from farms, agricultural people, would have done in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so he worked as an electrician for a while, but then he had an injury where I believe if I recall, he fell, hit his head, injuring his head severely, and that he was, there's indications that he was never really the same after that accident and blow to the head. But he was able to marry, not only get married, but to marry a girl from a family that was sort of higher in social status than his own background, his own family, a wealthy girl that he met in college. And so he married her and brought her back to the farm, where he was going to use his sort of engineering skills to be a successful farmer. The neighbors described him as being very intelligent, but also being a very impatient, sort of severe man, kind of a hot-tempered guy, very explosive temper. He was also a very meticulous person. He dressed really meticulously, sharp dresser, very concerned about appearance. But people reported that he, along with his explosive temper, is that he tended to be cruel towards his farm animals. Neighbors said that he at some point beat his own horse to death. So he showed signs of sort of explosive violence towards livestock. He was very tight with money, very thrifty. And he wasn't the best farmer in the world because he didn't really enjoy so much of the physical hard work. I mean, anybody who's done that knows that farming is very physically demanding job. When you work, morning till night, it's not an easy job. And since he was an engineering type, he kind of preferred the tinkering, the technical parts to farming and not the physical stuff. And so he actually wasn't very successful because he sort of shied away from the stuff that really needed to get done to have a successful farm. He, being someone who was good, or at least careful with money, I don't know about being good with money, but careful with money, he became and served as the treasurer for the local school board. but he often found himself with conflict with other board members in the community about expenses. He was, again, being tight-fisted, didn't want to spend any money on anything. He wanted to keep taxes very low and expenditures low. He didn't want himself to be taxed a lot to help fund the local schools. And so this he didn't really get along very well with the other board members, and people in the community he had trouble with. So when a new property tax was levied to build a new school, he claimed this was a financial hardship because he's going to have to pay more in taxes, property taxes. And also he had an additional stressor that his wife was ill and suffered from tuberculosis, which was expensive to treat medically. And so the bank eventually began to foreclose on his farm because he was spending a lot with various expenditures, taxes, and was not a particularly successful farmer in terms of the productivity of his farm. He ran for the city clerk and was defeated. Again, wanting to have an important station in the community and being an ambitious person, but not being a very popular one, being a difficult person, a person whose approach and values were tended to be in conflict with other people from the community. And so he became very angry at the community for his defeat, for the sense he felt of being rejected by the community, that he didn't win his race for city clerk. So Kehoe then stopped working on the farm. And again, so we're seeing here, as I mentioned in the overview video for this course, as you move through case studies, and we're going to generally do this through videos, but I thought I would open it up with a little lecture here. You don't want to just read through or look at a person's past, their background, what happened to them. You want to look at these things with an eye towards, well, what triggered the crime or crimes that occurred. So we're looking for that. And you can see here a lot of bad things happening to this guy, a lot of negative things that he took badly and it were making him very angry. So all of a sudden you see a sign, something's going wrong. He stopped working on the farm. His farm's been, like foreclosed upon. And so he's like, stops working. And he starts, people didn't realize this, but he starts purchasing pyritol, which is an expensive incendiary explosive used by farmers to loosen tree stumps, etc. So farmers would use explosives for certain farm purposes. So people didn't know any better that he was buying all this pyritol, but actually he was buying it with an evil intent. Kehoe saved pyritol for 1 year while he made plans to attack the local school. So this shows preparation. It shows forethought, that he was planning and buying and saving this pyritol, this explosive material, for months, for a year, all the while planning to attack the local school. In 1927, Kehoe was 45 years old, who just suffered a set of setbacks, various stressors that we just covered briefly. So what did he do? He set off a series of explosions at this school. He killed 45 people, mostly children, injured at least 58. Most of the kids were ages 7 to 12, the victims. So we're talking here, elementary age, school, getting into sort of middle school age kids, basically some elementary school situation. 45 dead, 58 injured. This was the deadliest mass murder in a school in U.S. history. Now we've seen some in recent years, so we've seen some big mass killings with lots of people dead, but these numbers are staggering. And notice how an interesting feature here is there's no guns involved, no guns used here. This is explosives. And this is one reason why I chose this as a case. This is an early case. We're talking 1927. So these mass killings, serial killers too, were not really on people's radars very much during those times. Yes, these crimes occurred, but they really hadn't moved to the forefront in the public's consciousness, the public's attention, until in more recent decades. But one reason why I chose this case is to show you that these sorts of serious crimes have been around for a long time. It's not just a recent phenomenon. So before hitting the school, he killed his wife by blunt force trauma to the head. Something that's common for these mass killers is they'll often take out family members before they take out the large numbers of strangers or other people. She just got home from the hospital. So he kills her. He blows up the farmhouse, farm buildings, destroys the animals. So this is a common thing you see, is that it's this, often these mass murders are this last act of destruction, where one destroys one's personal life in addition to going after the public. Earlier, he had arranged timed explosions throughout the new school building. So this was a new school building that was being built, with these taxes that he didn't want to pay, right? So you see the connection there? He had secretly been placing Pyritol throughout the basement of both wings for months. So look how premeditated, cold-blooded this is, packing away explosives in the basement throughout this new school. Because he was a board member, he had keys, he had access, and was able to do that for months without being detected. So think of this. That shows a lot of sneakiness, a lot of not only forethought and planning, but sort of cleverness, being able to do this stuff and not be detected. Nobody noticed, right? So he was pretty good at hiding his plans here. The materials in the north wing exploded as planned, killing 39 children and 2 adults. The 500 pounds of Pyritol, 500 pounds in the south wing, did not detonate. So his entire plan didn't even go off 100% as he had planned. So if it had, he would have killed even more, many more individuals. Before all of this, he packed his car with all sorts of metal items that would act as shrapnel, and packed the trunk with dynamite, the trunk of his car. The school explosion and fire attracted many local people who wanted to help. So you had this school explodes, the community gathers to try to help the victims. So you got a lot of local people there. Kehoe drove to the school, called the superintendent over to his car, detonated the explosives in the car, killing himself, killing the superintendent, a boy, and 2 other men in the vicinity. So again, a typical thing you'll see as we go through different case studies, a typical pattern that you see with mass killers is, doesn't always happen, but they commonly, quite often, will kill themselves in the end along with everybody else that they kill. So he obviously wanted to get maximum impact, where he's not only taking himself and his family out, but he's taking out as many people from the community as possible. Kehoe left a note on the fence that read, "Criminals are made, not born." So it was sort of his way, again, we're engaging in analysis here. It was his way of telling the community, you made me this way. I wasn't an evil person who wanted to kill dozens of people, but because of your rejection of me and all the troubles that the community has had with me, that you have turned me into this. So that's his way of explaining himself, how he got to the point where he could do such an evil deed. Okay, there's the end of the case study. So mass murder seems to be occurring with more frequency, and from roughly 1 per month to 1 every 10 days. Now, it depends on how you define mass murders, because different researchers will define it differently. So again, whenever you're studying mass murder or serial killers too, you have to ask, well, how are they defining? What does it take to be considered a mass killer? So just keep that in mind with definitions here. As you read the textbook, you'll see different types. Let's see. Mass murders do not refer to killings by powerful groups, but by individuals. So that's another definitional thing. And we're talking typically a lone killer, a lone offender, one person, who kills a whole bunch of people, kills and injures a whole bunch of people. Sometimes you can get team killers in the case of like Columbine High School, pairs, usually not too much more than pairs, but most often it's a lone killer. And we're not talking about being killed by, armies or I don't know, guerrilla warfare sort of thing where it's a warfare context of mass victims. We're not talking about that kind of context. It's a lone individual, possibly sometimes two people, but it's not some sort of organized organizational collective violence. It's an individual sort of violence, but the individual wants to take out a whole bunch of people. Um, that puts us at 15 minutes. Let's stop here and then we'll continue on next time in the second segment from this chapter.